Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I want to start out with a quick question to you, and that is, how did you learn relationship skills? Just think about in your life, how did you learn relationship skills? Any thoughts? Just say them out. Parents? Okay. Any others? Church. Any others? Trial and error, yeah. So a lot of times people learn about relationships from their own life experiences, from trying things, from making mistakes, hopefully learning from those mistakes. We also learn from observing others, like parents, personal role models, or observing what happens in the media. Now, notice that in any of these ways of learning relationship skills, we might learn healthy relationship skills, or we also might learn unhealthy relationship skills. But there are some kinds of people who actually don't ever learn healthy relationship skills on their own. And there are a number of different things that might prevent someone from having healthy relationships. And a big one is past trauma. Like, I've had a past client who had a sustained history of sexual abuse at the hands of her father. Now, you can imagine when someone, when the person who's most charged with keeping you safe in this world is the source of your violation, how that would impact your sense of safety in the world. Fear and anxiety might prevent people from having healthy relationships. Fear of intimacy, fear of abandonment, social anxiety, performance anxiety, hypervigilance, all these things might keep someone from forming and learning about healthy relationships. As a result of that, we get into a situation where there's a lack of experience. And people who are in their mid to late life, who have no relationship experience, who have no sexual experience, find that that actually compounds the problem, because they might be unwilling to share with the people that they're interested in that they don't have this experience. And so that becomes a barrier itself in helping them form connections. There are many different reasons why people might have a lack of experience. Everything from debilitating shyness to disabilities that might prevent someone from forming connections with people. Now, those disabilities might be a barrier not just in themselves, but because of the way they are perceived by others. I've talked with many people with disabilities who say, you know, I'm willing to try, but I feel that like other people treat me differently because of my disability. And you noticed that in the Lisa Ling clip where Justin was sharing how other people view him differently because of his disability. We also sometimes have people who are going through transitions or changes in their orientation, in their gender, and they might be inexperienced with the way that they're relating to themselves and their body and their sexuality right now. I had sometimes people don't feel comfortable in their own skin. I had a client once who told me that she she always felt like if she was going to be around other people, she had to be happy and joyful and the life of the party. So if she ever wasn't able to do this, she would isolate. And her friends would literally find that she would drop off the face of the earth for four, 4 or 5 months at a time and not return her calls. And so what impacted her healthy relationships was an unwillingness to be authentic and actually let people know what was going on with her, even if it was different than what she thought it should be. Sometimes people with really poor body image have difficulty being willing to take the risk to enter into a relationship. I've had clients who had such poor body image that they believed it would be harmful to someone else to allow that person to touch their body. Now, for situations like this, where for some reason or another, someone hasn't been able to form healthy relationships on their own, hasn't been able to have the type of connections that they want to have in their life, then this person might start out by seeing a therapist. And in this case, this therapist is Victoria King, who practices in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in some cases, the client can actually work through stuff and make progress with verbal therapy alone. However, that's not always enough. And I've worked with clients who had literally spent decades in verbal therapy and wasn't able to reach their goals. So in this situation, we can bring in another person. And this is me. And this is the structure of surrogate partner therapy. Surrogate partner therapy, it always involves 3 people. And we want to create a situation where someone who hasn't been able to form the type of connections that they want in their life has a safe and supportive environment in order to be able to learn these skills and to overcome anxiety and to do this. So in surrogate partner therapy, there's the client, there's the supervising therapist, and then there's also a surrogate partner. Each of these has clearly, each of the 2 professionals has clearly defined roles. And the therapist has roles before, during, and after the involvement of the surrogate. At the beginning, the therapist will evaluate whether this client will benefit from surrogate partner therapy, whether it's appropriate for it. They will educate the client about the objectives of the therapy, the boundaries that are involved, and the way it works. Then, once the surrogate becomes involved, the therapist will oversee the developing relationship, and they will support both the client and the therapist. After the surrogate is no longer involved, then the therapist will help the client to generalize these experiences to other relationships. Now, the surrogate will partner directly with the client and they will participate with the client in hands-on experiential exercises. And in so doing, the client and the surrogate will form a temporary relationship. This temporary relationship is the structure that allows the client to learn these skills and to overcome anxiety and to try new things, to experiment. We basically consider this like a laboratory. Now, the surrogate is also modeling healthy relationship skills, including vulnerability and authenticity. The timeline kind of looks like this. The client starts out by seeing a therapist, ideally, and then eventually we get to a point where it's determined that bringing a surrogate in on the case would be a good idea. So then we have a 3-way meeting, which is usually the only time where the 3 of us all meet together in the same room. After that, the client will start to see the therapist, and they'll also start to see the surrogate separately, alternating from one to the other. until eventually there's closure with the surrogate, and then ideally the client continues to see the therapist afterward. Now, I mentioned that the three of us first meet together in a three-way meeting. And so let's look at that a little bit. There are a number of reasons why we want to have a three-way meeting. The most important is to establish that we will all be working together as a team, and that there will be open communication between all of us. The client signs a written agreement that there will be communication between the surrogate and the therapist, and that we are able to communicate with each other. And basically, there will be communication between all three of us. Another important part of this meeting is to get really clear about what the goals are. It's a goal-driven process, and the progress of the therapy is determined in order to always be moving toward these goals, in order to help the client reach their objectives. So let's look at some common goals, and you may notice that these look familiar. These are all the same things that may prevent people from being in healthy relationships. And the typical client of surrogate partner therapy will have one or more of these characteristics. They will often have some amount of trauma in their past, physical trauma, sexual abuse, even medical trauma, emotional abuse, sometimes even spiritual abuse. They will generally have fairly high levels of fear and anxiety. They may have low experience. They may be unwilling to be authentic in their relationships, and they may have a poor body image. Now, another thing I want to add is there are some cases wherever there are specific sexual difficulties that the clients may need to look at, including things like vaginismus, delayed ejaculation, erectile dysfunction. However, it's been my experience in the 10 years that I've been doing this work that whenever there are sexual difficulties that show up, that those sexual difficulties are never the problem itself, but are typically a symptom of another problem. Symptom of another problem that involves a relationship difficulty, one of the others. And so rather than treating the symptom, we want to go in and actually determine what is the real issue. And because the client is forming a temporary relationship with the surrogate, whatever issues they have in forming relationship will show up as they start to form that relationship with the surrogate. And this is one of the gifts of the therapy, because when that issue is up, it allows it to be seen, understood, and resolved. So I want to tell you about something that happened early in my practice. I had a client who arrived for our first appointment. We had been talking by phone and by email, so I thought we had a pretty good rapport established. So when she showed up at my door for the first time, I asked her if she would like to share a hug. She said yes, and so we hugged. Then we continued for the rest of the appointment, which was 90 minutes long, and I thought that everything was okay. A few days later, I contacted her to see about scheduling another appointment. And she said, "Oh, I'm not coming back. I didn't feel safe there, and so I'm never coming back again." Now, I was completely astonished by this because I didn't notice any indication that there was anything wrong. And so I'm thankful to this day that she let me know what happened for her. And whenever I asked her if she wanted to share a hug, she didn't want to, and yet she didn't feel comfortable saying no. So she did something she didn't want to do. I didn't pick up on it, and then after that, she didn't feel safe. Now, this awareness completely changed the way that I work. And it really made me aware that how profound the social conditioning is and how difficult it is for some people to not only be aware of what they want, but to express it and to ask for what they want. There's a certain type of people, or a certain type of person, which I call the people pleaser archetype. And those who are people pleasers, like this particular client, may have difficulty knowing what they want and saying yes to what they do want and saying no to what they don't want. And so I realized that where we need to begin in this process is to establish this. We need to establish that the client has the awareness, the self-awareness to know what they want and what they don't want. Then they need to be able to say yes to what they do want, to ask for what they want, and to have boundaries against what they don't want. And the most common way that we do this is with communication. So what I've started to call these things the ABCs of SPT. Awareness, boundaries, and communication are the ABCs. And this is the foundation that needs to be established before we can start to do anything else. So if we look at the overall arc of the course of the relationship, of the course of the journey of surrogate partner therapy, and I call it the hero's journey because it really takes a lot of courage and depth to go through this whole process. We start out by working on the ABCs, awareness, boundaries, and communication. We invest a lot in building safety and trust. We assure that there's a good understanding of consent. We bring in touch. We work on body image. Along the way, we have sex education, and then eventually we get to the point where we can address whatever core issues the client has come into therapy to address. And then eventually, after those core issues, we move toward closure. It is a temporary relationship, and it's for specific therapeutic goals, and it's understood from the beginning that whenever those goals are reached and when the therapy is concluded, that the relationship will end. So you may be asking, well, how do we establish those ABCs? How do we verify that the client has the awareness to know what they want and that they're able to communicate it and set boundaries? And there are a number of ways that we do this. First is communication exercises where we practice these skills. We make requests of each other. We practice saying no and hearing no. And you may think that this is such an exercise would be kind of simple, but the exercises are specifically constructed to get more and more realistic and more complex. But we start out with the very basics at the beginning, and then once those basics are established, then we build upon them to get more and more realistic, more and more vulnerable, and more authentic. Another thing that we do is mindfulness practices involving touch. I don't know if you've heard the phrase Sense8 Focus, but Sense8 Focus are some touching exercises that involve simple touch. And this is a way to get direct experience of what feels good. A lot of times people relate to their body by the way that it looks, particularly by the way it compares with idealized objects like movie stars or models. Now, if you're relating to your body by the way it looks, you might be disappointed with it. However, if you close your eyes and allow yourself to be touched, you'll often find that you can experience pleasurable sensations from that touch, regardless of what gender you are or what body type you have, whether you're able-bodied or not, whether you're tall or short, what past experiences you've had. So if someone is willing to get to a point where they're able to experience touch, then this can start to refine their whole body image. Once you see the body as a source of pleasure, as opposed to something that doesn't look the way you want it to, then that's the first step toward changing body image. In general, we want to move from performance-oriented behavior toward pleasure-oriented behavior. As we do this touching, it helps us to build the awareness of what feels good, to increase the sensory vocabulary, and this is all really valuable as we move into deeper intimacy. Sense8 Focus is an important start to addressing body image, but we go actually far beyond that. In our intimate relationships, we become physically and emotionally naked. Now, there was a 2011 survey done in Britain. This particular survey was done with women. However, people of any gender can have body image issues. But in this particular survey, it found that 52% of the women surveyed avoid sex because they felt bad about how their bodies look. 13% would have sex only in the dark because they didn't want to be seen. And 10% would avoid sexual positions they'd otherwise enjoy because they thought that those positions were unflattering to certain parts of their bodies. So if you put all these together, that's 75% of women where body image impacts the pleasure that they experience. And so we do a lot of work with body image to really start to have a more accepting relationship with our body. And eventually, after we've done all this other stuff, we get to a point where the core issues can be addressed. And any aspect of relationship can be included, including social skills, including intimacy, even including sexuality. But any activity is only included under two conditions. And the first condition is that it's necessary to reach the goals. And the second condition is that what we've done so far has established a suitable foundation that would allow that activity to be corrective. We don't want to be reinforcing things that aren't working. And we don't want to be doing things that could potentially be re-traumatizing. And so we need to make sure that there's a suitable foundation in terms of awareness, boundaries, communication, comfort, skills. There's a suitable foundation that would allow whatever we do to be transformative and to be healing. And a big part of the conversation that we have between surrogate, client, and the therapist on the case is to determine if that's the case. So I'll ask the client, for example, so in the next appointment, we're going to do this exercise. Do you think you're ready for that? Do you think that would be beneficial? And so the pacing is basically customized for each individual client based on their own unique experiences. I mentioned that the relationship is temporary. That means it's going to end. And sometimes people ask, well, might it then be painful for the client when that relationship ends? And so I want to ask you now, have any of you ever had a relationship end? Well, so I think of surrogate partner therapy as giving a client experience with every phase of the entire life cycle of relationship, including the ending. Because sometimes clients are so afraid of what will happen at the end of a relationship that they won't even take the risk to begin the relationship in the first place. Now, it's understood that there may be feelings at the end of that relationship. There may be sadness. There may be grieving, both on the part of the client and on the surrogate. It is a real relationship, and there are going to be feelings, but those feelings can be survived and managed. And we can take what we've learned from the relationship and the better person that we've become and generalize them to future relationships, more able then to have relationships in the future. I always tell my clients, I'm here for your future relationships. That's where my commitment is. That's the only reason for me being in your life. And in fact, I've developed another presentation both for surrogates as well as for therapists that I do called Helping to Generalize the Surrogate-Client Relationship, which is all about this process. So if you want to learn more, we're going to have plenty of time for questions right now, but there's a couple places you can learn more. You've already seen the This is Life with Lisa Ling clip. There's also my website, which has lots of videos and information, surrogatepartner.us. There's also the website of the International Professional Surrogates Association, which is surrogatetherapy.org. And available on the IPSA website is a 22-minute documentary that's available in DVD format that's called Surrogate Partners Intimate Profiles. This was a documentary that was created in the 80s, and parts of it are a little out of date, like particularly the hairstyles. Um, but there's a lot of good information, and it also has interviews with clients, therapists, as well as surrogates, and it shows examples of the types of exercises that we do. So if you want that, you can access that from the IPSA website. The DVD is free, but there's a nominal charge to handle shipping. So that's available also. Yeah, I wrote to the guy who who produced this in the 1980s, and he gave me permission to edit out the parts that aren't as current and leave in the parts that are accurate and provide it to you as a way of educating people about the practice. We don't have permission to put it online, but we do have permission to send it to you as a DVD. And I know more and more people don't even have any way to play DVDs. So, um, if you have any questions, you can ask them now. Or if there's a question that's too sensitive or that you don't feel comfortable asking right now, you're also welcome to reach out to me by email or by phone at the contact information given above. So um, now we want to have time for questions, right? I did my training with an organization called the International Professional Surrogates Association, and there's a certification process that consists of two parts. There's a 12-day class, which is all day, every day. And in this class, there's a combination between lecture and information, as well as each trainee is partnered with another trainee in the class who becomes their training partner. And they work through the typical sorts of hands-on exercises that we do with clients. Then, if the class is completed successfully, there is, you know, I've heard the saying that a Freudian slip is when you say one thing and you mean your mother. But, but so if the class is completed successfully, then you'd be approved to move on to the second phase of training, which is the internship. And in the supervised internship, the intern will see clients while they are under the supervision of a more experienced surrogate who mentors them. So every case they have or every session they have with a client, they're then not only checking in with the therapist on the case, but they're also checking in with their mentor. And it took me 2 years personally to go through the internship process. And now I'm mentoring other surrogates who are in the internship phase of their training. Now, there is no legal licensure or, or licensing for surrogate partners. No state or federally, offers that. So instead, the International Professional Surrogates Association has developed a certification program and a code of ethics and other structures intended to assure the general public as well as therapists that we work with that surrogates are well trained and operating ethically, and that there's an accountability process that goes along with this. It's understood right from the beginning that the relationship is going to be temporary and that it's for specific therapeutic goals, and that whenever those goals are reached, that the relationship is going to end. And it's understood that there's going to be a time of no contact at the end. This is really important because we don't want the client to be reliant on the surrogate. We want them to be able to go out and spread their wings and to try things with other people and to use their skills in other contexts. And so it's understood that there's going to be a time of no contact for at least 6 months. Often, I won't hear from clients at all, and I consider that a good thing. And then sometimes I'll hear notes from people like in a year or two saying, "Oh, I've formed a relationship. I've been with my partner for 2 years now, um, and so there is sometimes contact. I get letters from people, um, saying what's going on and or expressing gratitude for what we've done together, and that's always nice to hear." the biggest thing I want to dispel is that sometimes people use the title sex surrogate to refer to what I do or what I am. And in fact, there was a movie in 2012 called The Sessions. Yeah. And it starred Helen Hunt, and she was playing the role of a surrogate partner named Cheryl Cohen Green, who was practicing in Berkeley in the 1980s, and she was seeing a client named Mark O'Brien, who was severely disabled from polio and who could only leave his iron lung for a few hours every day. And in that movie, they used the phrase sex surrogate. And what this, so I don't like the phrase sex surrogate because it creates the impression that it's all about sex, which is the biggest myth that I want to dispel. And so let me give an example. Imagine you had a professional chef who could make a variety of appetizers and entrees, but also spend about 10% of his time making pastries. I'm sure you would find it really misleading to call that person a pastry chef, right? Because you're taking what's a small part of his job and you're putting it in the title. And that's why I don't like sex surrogate. Instead, there's so much other stuff that what goes on. And if there is sex involved, it's only after so much other stuff has been done previously. Because it's simply not going to be beneficial to take someone and throw them in bed with a sexual partner. That's going to be harmful and likely even re-traumatizing. And that sort of behavior is what's caused many of the problems that we seek to overcome. And the way to heal something is not to replicate it. So that's really the biggest thing. There is potential for sexual contact, but in very specific conditions. And there's checks and balances set up in this process to make sure that those conditions have been established. So that's probably the biggest misconception that I have to overcome over and over again. And it shows up when people ask about the legality of it. The reason that people have questions about its legality is that they think that it's an exchange of sex for money. And so I really want to distinguish between surrogate partner therapy and something that might be illegal. And I like to give an analogy. So suppose someone went in to see a sex worker or a prostitute, and the sex worker said, well, I'm willing to see you, but you first have to start seeing this therapist who will make sure that you benefit from the time that you spend with me. And I'm not even going to guarantee that we'll ever have sex. And so if you heard that and said, well, that's not what I want, that's one thing. But if you heard that and said, oh, that's exactly what I need to resolve this issue, I haven't been able to resolve it any other way, then surrogate partner therapy might be a good option. And so there was a local TV station in Alexandria, Virginia that did an in-depth investigation into surrogate partner therapy. And as part of that, they interviewed their legal analyst, and this is the opinion that he gave about the practice.
CBS 19's legal analyst Scott Goodman says it's a gray area.
There is a lot of similarity between surrogate partnership therapy and prostitution because you have money changing hands, you have sex taking place of one kind or another.
He says it's possible a surrogate partner could be charged with prostitution, but unlikely they'd ever be convicted.
Because I think once a jury heard some of the background and heard some of the training and what goes on with this type of therapy and the professionalism involved, I don't think anybody would find this to be against the law.
So legal, there's no laws or legislation anywhere that specifically addresses surrogate partner therapy. And so, in the absence of specific, well, actually, that's not the case. There's in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, um, a reference to surrogate partner therapy has been built into the professional code for psychotherapists. But that's the only place I know where it has specifically been addressed and specifically identified as legally, unambiguously accepted. But since um, there is no laws in any state or federally in the United States, the precedent becomes really important. And in more than 45 years, IPSA is not aware of any surrogate or any supervising therapist that has ever been charged with anything. And um, California State Senator Kamala Harris, who until recently was a candidate for a Democratic candidate for president in 2020. She's on record as having said, if it's between consensual adults and referred by licensed therapists and it doesn't involve minors, then it's not illegal. Whenever there are cases of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, what someone learns in that situation is what they want doesn't matter. Eventually, in these situations, they have no choice but to sacrifice some part of themselves, their integrity, their alignment. There's something in that they give up in order to get along in the world, in order to survive in this abusive situation. Often, what they give up is an alignment with themselves and with something larger than themselves. They give up a sense of their own divinity. Because if I did have a sense of my own divinity, then this stuff wouldn't be happening to me. So it just doesn't make sense. I will learn that what I want doesn't matter, and basically there's something wrong with me, right? Because it could only be that there was something wrong with me that has caused me to experience these things. A young child simply isn't able to blame, their parents or their caretakers because their parents and their caretakers are responsible for their livelihood. At this point, it does really mean survival. And so the only way that I can make sense of this in my mind is to think that this is only happening because there's something wrong with me and because there's something that I'm not doing right or that I'm not good enough. And really, there comes a time in surrogate partner therapy where we really get down to this underlying sense of worthiness. And we want the client to see that they do matter and what they want matters and that they deserve to be able to feel pleasure. They deserve to have healthy connections. They deserve to be treated with respect and compassion. And sometimes in the therapy, it's the client's first experience of ever being treated with compassion. And it may be the first time that they open up to allow themselves to be treated kindly. Like, I had one client who said to me, you know, you're the first man who's ever treated me with respect. And I said, well, I'm honored to have been the first man to treat you with respect. However, I know I won't be the last. And so in that way, I hope to validate and acknowledge the experience that we've shared together, but still continue to point toward the future and the generalization of that experience to other relationships and other situations where that's possible. So a big part of generalization is to not only have the experience, but to help the client deepen their understanding of this experience. Wow, so what do I do to help you feel safe? What can you do to create safety for yourself? When do you notice that happening? What does it feel like in your body? Now, as I talk, I've been using she and her to refer to my clients because I work predominantly with or with women, trans women and cis women. However, there are surrogates of various genders and orientations who work with clients of various genders and of orientations. So I don't want there to be any limitation. In fact, there are more female surrogates than male surrogates. It is a genuine relationship, and there are genuine feelings that arise, both on the part of the client and on the part of the surrogate. And actually, this is what makes surrogate partner therapy different than the client going off and try to resolve these issues through dating. Because when you're dating, you have these two people and they each have their own fears, their own issues, their own needs, their own agendas, and their own triggers. And sometimes all of these interact in a way that is incredibly complex and sometimes results in none of them getting their needs met. And so what we want to do in surrogate partner therapy is that at least one of the people is willing to put their agenda on the side and be completely devoted to helping the other person reach their goals. That being said, as Ray said, I am human. I have feelings, triggers, reactions. I'm not, I don't have it all together myself all the time. And whenever I started to do this practice, I had the belief that there was a certain way that I had to be in order to be a good surrogate. You know, I had to have a certain image. And that was stressful for me because I couldn't always live up to that. But eventually I realized that that wasn't a good thing either for me or the client, because as I'm having an image, I'm modeling inauthenticity for the client, which is not what we want to model. So eventually I let go of this idea that there's a certain way to be, and I realized that my most important job is to be authentic. Even if I have fear and sadness, even if I don't know for sure what to do next, even if I have insecurity. And so I want to take every opportunity that I have to be vulnerable with the client as a way of modeling vulnerability. And then I'll ask, so as I shared that with you, how did you feel? Do you feel closer to me now than you did before? So there have been, and as I have these feelings, I want to have enough self-awareness. I think of it like this way. I need to be both on the dance floor, engaging in the dance with the client, and at the same time, I need to be in the balcony watching the dance from above. Because I need to have that objective perspective in order to make sure that whatever I'm doing is in the client's best interest. And I still want to be real and genuine because that real, genuine feedback is one of the most valuable parts of the therapy. And so I've had times where I've been frustrated with a client, where I've even felt anger, where I've been sad that the relationship ends. And so it's my job to get as close as people as possible and then let them go over and over again. And sometimes it can be challenging. Especially, there was a time 2 years ago where I was going through a breakup in my personal life, and my best friend and I had a falling out. So there was a time whenever my best male friend and I weren't talking. And then I was finishing up with a client that I had been working with for 2 years. And so that was hard for me because it was a lot of loss all at once. And I basically was completely upfront about this with the therapist, and the therapist and I like made a decision about how much to share with the client, right? Because one of the things that we want to enforce is that there's a difference between feelings and the action that we take based on those feelings. We want to get really comfortable with completely accepting all of our feelings and then choosing what to do. And most people, when they equate love with ownership. They say, oh, well, I love you. That means you can never leave me because I'll be devastated. And we really want to distinguish between, oh, I can have feelings of sadness, but I'm so committed to what it is that we're doing here that we are going to keep our agreements regardless. And those agreements involve moving on.
I want to allow for one more question. Yep, we're in. How fortuitous.
So you seem to be very strong on a lot of the concepts we've learned for clinical therapy, and I've been impressed with a lot of the things you're saying. And I understand that there are both ethical and psychological reasons for keeping the partner therapy separate from the supervising mental health therapy. So how do you delineate as things come up in your partner therapy sessions what you should be addressing and what needs to go back to the supervising therapist to deal with to keep those realms separate?
That's an excellent question. Basically, I want to allow as much as possible to be that can be done verbally to be addressed with the verbal therapist. But what happens is that as I'm doing experiential work with the client, hands-on work, sometimes there is stuff that will arise in the moment. and it needs to be addressed during that session. And so I will address it to the best of my ability, but mostly just as a way to create acceptance. Then I will talk with the therapist and I'll say, this is what happened. I think that the conversation that we started is one that would be valuable to continue. And so I'm basically forming a relationship with the client. And because of that, that makes some things easier to communicate and other things more difficult to communicate. I had one client who told me, so I'm confused about how to relate with you. If I see you as a therapist, I would tell you everything. But if I see you as a man I'm beginning a relationship with, I'm not going to tell you everything. Right? She had the idea that in order to form a relationship with someone, that she would only show them the things that she wanted them to see, the things that reflect positively on her. And one time she was having a conversation with the therapist and she said something really vulnerable. And the therapist said, "What you said to me, I want you to go say that to Andrew at your next appointment if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to take that risk." And at first she was horrified and said, "Oh, I could never do that." But eventually she realized that not only is that possible, but it's valuable and that it builds closeness. So in these cases where there are some times where I am not the best person to help the client realize something, right? Particularly if there's projections placed on me, I'm not the best person to help the client become aware of those projections. And in that case, the objective perspective of the therapist is invaluable. I got into a standoff once with a client where I know that there was no way that we could have resolved it between the two of us. I think that I'm an excellent communicator, but there was nothing that I could do in order to move us closer to resolution. And so it was really valuable for the verbal therapist to present an objective perspective that the client was more able to hear from the therapist than she was from me. So often clients will have ideas or thoughts come up after they leave the appointment, and that's also really valuable to process that with the therapist afterward. And sometimes clients have shame about the fact that they need this kind of help, and so they haven't told their friends and family that they're seeing a surrogate. And as a result, sometimes the therapist is their only support structure. And for that reason, it's also very valuable. So has this answered your question about how we distinguish? Basically, do what I have to in the moment. And sometimes there's real value in addressing a topic as it's happening. But the therapist can help create a deeper emotional and cognitive understanding of this and bring in greater objectivity and greater ability to generalize.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, let's thank Andrew for his time. And yeah, Andrew, I will be in touch via email.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate your great questions.
I really appreciate you. Bye.
Okay, bye.